everyone. My name is Amy Brown, Director of Events and Education for Trade Press Media Group. Thank you for joining us for today's webcast, 5 Ways Technology Can Support Facility Maintenance, Sustainability, and Security. Our presenter today is Joe McGay, Product Manager for TMA Systems. Joe is responsible for gathering feedback from customers and planning product roadmaps. He has over 10 years experience in the CMMS industry, including 7 years as a senior implementation consultant for TMA. He's worked primarily with customers in higher education, government, healthcare, and manufacturing throughout his career. Today's webcast learning objectives include discussing how technology can help move to a proactive and preventative approach, review ways to secure a facility and track who has building access and to which locations, learn how technology can empower analytical and forward-thinking approaches. A few details before we get started with today's event. We do encourage audience questions throughout the webcast, and to submit your question, please navigate to the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and type in your questions. Our presenters will answer as many questions as time permits. At the conclusion of today's webcast, you'll receive a PDF copy of today's slides. You'll also receive a link to a brief online assessment. Upon a successful completion, you'll be able to receive your CEU certificate. Today's webcast will be also archived at healthcarefacilitiestoday.com/webcast. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Joe.
Yeah, thank you very much, Amy, and thanks everybody that has joined us so far. So I know we're speaking kind of specifically to a healthcare audience, so I'll try to tailor some of the talking points here to that. Some additional background before we get into the agenda and the presentation. So as the intro kind of said, I initially started in facilities maintenance as an implementation consultant. So traveled out to Washington, D.C. and actually worked on at a customer site for a couple of years as a contractor. And, wasn't really sure. I didn't have a ton of experience in the area, but, working with all of the facilities maintenance techs, I ended up just loving it, and I've never looked back since. So very much enjoy working in the maintenance industry and very much enjoy working with all the folks in the different trades. So a lot of deep respect, having worked with them for now over 10, 12 years, something like that. So yeah, again, thanks everybody for joining the presentation today. So as we kind of mentioned the agenda here, we're going to try to get like 5 takeaways here. And the first one we'll do is proactive facilities maintenance, sustainability, security. I am going to talk a little bit about analytics and reporting, and then, technology to leverage. So we'll kind of summarize it all up with the final slide. So with that being said, we'll just kind of go ahead and get right into it. I think you've already seen some of the background here, so I won't make you read that again. But yeah, let's get started with proactive facilities maintenance. And, the kind of tagline that I put on this particular slide was the best facilities maintenance operations are often the ones that you don't notice. So I'm sure for some of the folks that are listening, you know as well as I do that it's pretty infrequent that you get phone calls and everybody is saying, hey, the temperature is perfect in this room, all the lights are working. We only get the phone calls when things aren't working. So, a lot of times I think at a lot of organizations, facilities maintenance isn't really properly appreciated for how often things are working. And we only really hear about it when things aren't working. So I am certainly aware of that. And I think hopefully as we go through the presentation, especially when we talk about reporting and KPIs and things, we'll try to point out some ways to get some more visibility of all the hard work that everybody does in the maintenance group. Oops, go back. So the first slide I have for this proactive facilities maintenance, just a couple of things that we always do and recommend. And especially when I was doing product implementations, these would be some of the first conversations we would have is how can we streamline the assignment of work orders? So what we really want to do is just try to eliminate any of those kind of choke points of places where work orders and work requests end up having to sit on somebody's desk before they get handed to either a trade supervisor or a technician who's going to do the work. And, that's through no fault of really anybody. We have maintenance coordinators, and it's not their full-time job to always just be constantly monitoring that queue. There's other things that they're doing as well. So if and when we can find some of those efficiencies of auto assigning work orders, for example, and this kind of first bullet I have here is using workflows, and a lot of different software tools will have either a rules engine, a workflow engine, but a way of auto assigning work orders to available technicians. So that might be who's closest to the issue. So if it's a multi-building campus, if it's a city, that kind of thing, obviously we want to auto assign things to somebody who's closest to the work. But then we also need to worry about who has the proper training. So, I need to make sure I'm sending an electrician to particular work orders. So it can take a little bit of work to get that kind of algorithm worked out of how we auto assign some of the work orders. But it's really worth it at the end of the day if we're not always having to rely on, maybe a maintenance coordinator or a trade supervisor to be having to be at their desk constantly assigning these work orders. So that's one tool I always recommend, is try to look for something like that. Another thing we do at TMA, and I'm sure other systems do as well, but always make that queue of work orders visible to trades and technicians. So as things are coming in, I don't really want to restrict their ability to see, requests that are flowing in for particular buildings or for their trades. So, we set it up where it would be available on a mobile device, that a technician would see those open work orders for the facility that they're in, and then hopefully grab some of them off the stack. So always try to make sure that we reward those technicians or acknowledge when they're being proactive and taking some of the work orders that are coming in, and they just grab it themselves, assign it to themselves, and kind of proactively take care of it. Then the final one is pretty standard, I think, for pretty much any CMMS system would do this. But we want to make sure we're pre-assigning scheduled maintenance to crews at the very least, if not an individual, in advance of them generating. So, again, this is just one of those choke points where as those PMs generate our preventive maintenance work orders, if they have to sit on somebody's desk to be assigned, we're just losing some time. So if we want to hit those KPIs, make sure we're compliant with all our due dates and compliant with all the kind of priorities and the SLAs we have with the folks around a hospital, we definitely want to make sure that we're pre-assigning as much stuff as we possibly can. So the other thing I'll mention here when we talk about proactive facilities maintenance is, what are the repairs? How do we identify them, and what caused them? So this is where I start to think of, if we properly implement a good work order system, a good CMMS, EAM type system, we're making sure that this isn't just a ticketing system. We could just get work orders and close them, but we lose an awful lot of information and context if we don't start tracking these things properly. So this first one is kind of near and dear to my heart. I call this PM repairs. You may hear different terminology, but these are repairs that are identified while you're doing your preventive maintenance. And a lot of times, what I consider a bit of an oversight for some of our customers is a technician will start performing their preventive maintenance work, and being proactive, they're finding issues that they need to fix at a piece of equipment, and they'll end up just fixing that stuff, and they'll roll that time that they spent in their comments into that preventive maintenance work order. And we don't really ever know that they performed kind of a major repair and they identified it while they were doing preventive maintenance. I want to track those with separate tickets. We can either auto generate them with things, we'll talk about failure codes in a minute. But I want to auto generate those work orders and properly document repairs that we're identifying in preventive maintenance, because it tells us how effective our preventive maintenance is. So if I'm going every quarter and I'm finding an issue before a customer had to report something to me or a building occupant, that's telling me, my preventive maintenance is working. It's effective. We're finding issues when we're going out and doing this work. So this is the first one. I always want to make sure that I track this kind of information. The second one we have here is using failure codes. So when we do have those corrective work orders and we're going and fixing things, what was the cause of the failure? So once we get some of that information, it's going to tell us a lot of context of what's going on in our facility. So, if I'm constantly finding issues with particular components of a piece of equipment, that leads me to make all sorts of other informed decisions. Maybe, our manufacturer, we need to talk to them about particular issues with equipment that we've purchased. It might be the certain kinds of parts that we're buying. And it's also, think of our maintenance schedules and our maintenance procedures. If I keep finding a particular component of a piece of equipment is failing, I want to be able to report on that so that I can eventually, maybe we change our procedures to look at something more specifically, look at it more often. So it gives you a ton of context and you can make all sorts of informed decisions when you have failure codes. Additionally, with failure codes, you'll see a lot of systems will let you kind of do root cause analysis. So you might have a failure code, then you might have a cause of that failure. And then ultimately you'll want to know what the resolution was. What was the action taken by the technician? And it takes a while to develop some of these things, but gradually as we get this, I can really start onboarding and training new techs way faster if I can give them some information of these are the top 3 most common failures with this particular piece of equipment. These were the top 3 causes of that. And these were the 2 things that we typically had to do to fix it. Having that information is incredibly beneficial. And then the last one that I've mentioned here is IoT devices. And this has become kind of a big buzzword in the industry, but predictive maintenance. So I mentioned it here in the slide. So with IoT devices, you have building automation systems and there will be sensors, I'm sure, installed all over your facility on your different pieces of equipment. And what's nice about the IoT devices is they can tell us when to do our maintenance just in time. So our manufacturers give us recommendations on, when to perform certain types of maintenance, but that's our best guess. And the example I always give when I'm thinking of this is with my car, if I do an oil change every 5,000 miles, that's probably best practice. But for all I know, if I was driving it particularly hard, maybe that should be 4,232 miles. Or maybe I don't drive it that hard and it's actually 6,114 miles. There is some metric, there's some measurement that an IoT device could give us that would tell us when to perform that maintenance and only then. So it's kind of that just-in-time idea of doing our maintenance. And that's really what predictive maintenance is. So once we're getting some of those sensors and alarms and things, they will tell us when to perform our maintenance as opposed to kind of sticking to a rigid kind of calendar-based preventive maintenance. And, I have to mention this too, because I know we have a healthcare audience. We can't always switch to predictive maintenance. I know that the regulatory compliance is pretty stringent on following manufacturer recommendations. So it's not always something you can do, but it's certainly something to look into of taking some of those building automation system sensors and letting them generate the work for you. That is the great proactive maintenance is let's do just what we need to do just in time. So we have constrained budgets. We don't have all the techs that we need. We need to make the most efficient use of them. And this is a great way to do that. So I kind of touched on this a little bit as we were talking about the IoT, but we want to also refine our PM schedules based on data. And so I kind of called it out, right? I know, Joint Commission requirements would say we can't deviate from those manufacturer recommendations on the types of equipment that they cover, but there's other equipment, I'm sure, at your facilities that aren't subject to the same stringent recommendations, or you can always, if it's worth it to do the documentation, you can do your alternate equipment maintenance and just document properly why you've changed the frequency of your PM so that, if you do get an audit from Joint Commission, something like that, that you have the documentation they need of why you deviated from manufacturer recommendations. But That being said, so if I check something every 6 months, and this is, going back to what we talked about with PM repairs. But again, if I check something every 6 months and I rarely ever get that PM repair ticket, so I'm not ever really finding an issue, maybe we're doing it too often. Maybe I want to start kind of moving that back. Maybe we try it every 9 months. We try it once a year and just start calibrating that, where we're only checking when we're starting to find actual wear and tear that we need to address. And again, the whole idea is that, we have constrained budgets. We don't have all the people we need. We have an awful lot of work to do. So the extent that we can buy ourselves some time, find some efficiencies, it's worth looking at. The opposite is also true though, too. So if I'm checking something and I find an issue every single time I go, and we're doing that every 6 months, it's possible I'm not checking frequently enough. So I would trust all the audience here. I'm sure we've had some facility managers that they'll know based on the kind of criticality of that asset, whether we can start, calibrating these schedules a little bit different. So, it is different in a healthcare facility, but again, there's definitely equipment that I'm sure you're maintaining that maybe we could back off on some of the maintenance and spend our time elsewhere. So these first 2 bullet points too, I kind of mentioned this where we don't need all that technology actually in this case. We just need better business processes. If we track those repairs that we're doing when we're finding them during preventive maintenance, we'll have the data we need to review. But we don't have to use the IoT devices, for example. That being said, on that the second list of bullets here, ideally, if we do have that technology installed with the building automation system, we want to have those integrations. So set those integrations up with your work order systems, let them tell you when there's problems with the equipment. Again, just really great proactive strategy to doing the maintenance. And then also, why are we changing the filter if it isn't dirty? Maybe we're just looking at the pressure differential as it's going through those filters, and as soon as it hits that threshold and we get an alarm from our building automation system, that's when we'll go and change the filters. So think of all the kind of money and time we could save if we knew we didn't have to change our filters every 3 months. Maybe it's every 4 months and 2 days. Over time, that stuff really adds up. So moving to our next kind of topic and takeaway, sustainable facilities management. So I've mentioned it several times because in all my travels with facilities maintenance operations, I've yet to see one where they said, yeah, we have all the budget we need. We can do absolutely everything that we want to do. So being sustainable, not just in terms of, utility usage, but sustainable with our budgets and our people and our resources, really important. So a couple of quick bullets here of this, path towards sustainable practices and facilities maintenance. The first one that I'll bring up is kind of, just right in line with sustainability, how we're defining it here, but we want to find an energy management system and module. Many of you probably have something, although I will say I've been at a lot of facilities where we're still getting those paper copies of our bills and we're kind of manually dealing with those invoices. There's a lot of information in those bills though of the energy usage that we have at our different buildings, our different meters, potentially with even specific piece of equipment. So extremely good to have that information and put it in a software program. The second one, kind of related as we talk about energy management systems and modules, is integrate this with a CMMS if at all possible. So, tracking all that usage is great and we can get some great reports. But imagine what we can do once we set it alongside our actual work order data. So if I've done capital projects to put in LED lighting or solar panels, things like that, that data is in my CMMS system. I have all that work order information. So now as I'm starting to see trends and usage going down at different buildings, I can set that alongside, well, what did we do that actually got us to be more efficient, more sustainable? It makes it a lot easier to justify capital expenditures when I can bring that kind of data. So if I go to my leadership team and I have some data showing them that, look, we get a return on investment for these types of capital projects within 2-3 years, they're a lot more likely to start supporting some more expenditures in those areas. So an energy management system on its own, it doesn't have all of that context that you're going to get once you have that work order data alongside it. So integrate if at all possible. It's definitely worth it, in my opinion. The last one is a bit unconventional as we talk about sustainability, but I would like to bring this one up as well. So managing your storeroom, and the main thing I'm talking about here is just make sure you have your inventory minimums set at their proper level. We don't want to be purchasing things that we don't need, in the immediate term. So some of the factors in making sure that you have the right minimum set is how critical is the part. So if it's something where our facility shuts down or our emergency generator is not going to come on, when, whatever that is, then certainly we need to have those things on the shelf. But the other thing we need to think about is what's the lead time to get the part? So what I've seen with a lot of organizations is, they're not factoring in how easy it is to source particular parts. They're buying a lot, those things are staying on the shelf, and we've just tied up a bunch of cash flow for no great reason. So there are some kinds of parts where I could walk out my door and throw a rock in any direction and have that part at my house in an hour. So if that's the case, and it's not just an absolutely critical part, do we really need it on the shelf? And I think in a lot of cases we don't. So we can really trim that budget and our cash flow and everything that's sitting on that shelf. If we know that that lead time is so short and I have multiple suppliers that could get it to me, maybe we start kind of paring that back and we don't have as much on the shelf. Okay, we'll skip forward and talk a little bit about building security. So this is one that I think a lot of times gets forgotten when we talk about CMMS and work order systems and facilities maintenance, of how important this is. So there's a couple of reasons that's important. Is for one thing, keys, lock hardware, all that kind of stuff is expensive. So we need to make sure that we know who has what keys. When you lose a key, we end up with a really expensive issue if it's a grandmaster key in a large building. So there's some cost issues here, but more importantly, it's about security of the building occupants. So that's a big responsibility within facilities, that we know who has access to what spaces at all times. And the extent that we can control that, we can make sure that we're protecting our building occupants, the folks that are in the facilities. And it's not just from people coming in the building that shouldn't, it's also making sure that they stay out of areas they shouldn't be in. So I always think of mechanical spaces, and I've worked a lot in higher education, and the students can be pretty clever of getting into some of those mechanical spaces. And as I'm sure most of the folks on this call know, that can be very, very dangerous for the person, but also, we can damage things, really important equipment if the wrong people are in the wrong rooms. So two kind of major things that I've come across in my travels doing facilities implementations, but the first one is these interchangeable cores and the hard key access. And a lot of facilities will have a hybrid. We'll talk about electronic key cards here in a minute. So a lot of facilities will have a bit of a hybrid where they do have some electronic key cards, but maybe they've keyed all their maintenance stuff with these interchangeable cores. One thing I would say is if we do have that hard key access, we want to make sure that we're making smart decisions around separate keyways. So, I'll exaggerate to make a point. When we have a grandmaster key, for example, that would open absolutely every door in a building, then, I've opened up a bit of a liability there. If and when, somebody misplaces that key, that means I'm going to have to rekey the entire building. So to the extent that we can, maybe the custodial spaces will have their own keyway, and our mechanical spaces, our, office areas, patient areas, things like that. And we try to separate that out to an extent so that, in the event of a lost key, we don't necessarily, have to replace every lock and key in the building. So making good decisions around those things. And a lot of this is contractor access type information too, of, you know, what could we give them with a single key and let them get into the spaces that they need to get into. So the next thing I speak about here is this installing key cabinets or key tracking systems. So a key cabinet is a pretty analog way, but it certainly works. And I've seen a bunch in my different customer implementations. So some of them are really, really simple, where I've issued a key to a technician and it's serialized and I know which technician owns what key. For them to access any building master keys or anything like that, we just go to a key cabinet. They will have to enter their key that identifies them before they can pull a master key out of the cabinet. And so in the event of if they were to lose a key, we know exactly who lost the key. They've left their key in the cabinet. We know exactly who was the last person that was there. And the other way to do this, there's some digital type systems, so key track systems, where there's a little bit of software behind it. So it's a similar concept where it would be a box and maybe they come up with their employee ID card and they scan that. And instead of leaving a key, they've left their employee ID card, and then they can pull particular keys, provided they have the access level to pull those building masters or campus grandmasters, all that kind of stuff. And the benefit of that is if I ever needed to run reports of who had what key at what time, having a little bit of software behind that can be really, really helpful. You know, the key cabinet that I mentioned before, you know, it works to a degree, but there are times I'm sure that you guys may have encountered where, you know, leadership may ask us, you know, 6 weeks ago, something went missing in a particular room, whatever it is. And I need to know who had access to those rooms at that time. With some software behind that and maybe a module in a CMMS, that would be the type of information you could pull pretty easily. So I mentioned that kind of towards the end of what I was saying, but just, you know, look at key management modules in a CMMS if they offer it. Some software behind that stuff can be really helpful pulling reports, because leadership will often want to see who has what keys and what opens what doors. The other way to handle building access here, and this is probably the ideal way, but we think of the electronic key cards. You know, they can be expensive to implement, but I would always recommend constantly taking a look at this, because you do get complete control over the building access and immediately restricting access if a key card's been compromised. So, you know, a story that I remember from working actually with a university was they had hard key access in an entire sports arena, actually. And a contractor took a grandmaster key and lost it and ended up having to rekey that entire facility. And it was, you know, upwards of $150,000. That was the cost of losing a key like that. Whereas if we were giving them an electronic key card, I don't really have that concern. So kind of my last bullet point, but I'll mention it now. We can set expiration dates on these. So one of the biggest issues that I've always found with key access and building access, you know, I'm a little less worried about my employees than I am the contractors that we have in. So, you know, we're not always necessarily escorting those contractors to all the places they're going, depending on your facility. They may come to the office and we have to give them a key, and then they're off in our facility without much control over it. Well, when we can give them key card access, electronic key card access, I know what doors they're opening, and I can set those expirations so that, you know, if they're not going to return on Friday when they're done with their project to give me the key back, I'm not as worried. So I'd like them to give me the electronic key card back, but if they don't, it's not the worst thing in the world. I would also say that, you know, I think the expense is justified in a lot of cases, that you will have potential savings. So, you know, you think of all that door and lock hardware, that stuff isn't cheap either. So yes, you'll have batteries and a big implementation. There's some software around the electronic key cards. But ultimately, I think you can justify it that it would be, there would be some cost savings there, especially when you consider the liability. The other thing I'd mention, I think it's, you know, For healthcare facilities, I know you all would deal with this in the same way that the campuses do, but I'll again just point out that feature of being able to lock down buildings from a central console. So if you have a security office, a campus security, if you know you need to lock down those doors, that having that kind of push button ability to do it immediately is really, really important. So certainly in schools, K through 12, we have those kinds of things, but I know in hospitals as well. So something to consider. So our next takeaway, we'll talk about analytics and reporting. So this is one of those things where I always remember my days doing the implementations and the trainings with different technicians. And, the constant question was, you're giving me 500 things that I need to do. You've trained me on how to use all this software. I have tablets. I'm entering all this data. What is the point of all of this? I could go and fix things and fix a lot more things if I wasn't dealing with putting in all this information into a work order system. And this is really where I get to the analytics and reporting. So ultimately, this is hopefully the kind of pot of gold at the end of the rainbow when you've successfully implemented a work order system. This is what we're after at the end of the day. So good reporting and analytics, it's going to provide leadership with the actionable information. And if we've done everything properly, you're going to get a return on your investment with a CMMS platform, because we have the reports to give you, again, that actionable information where I can make informed decisions about my business of, where am I going to invest more time and money into, where am I not going to invest time and money into. So again, just kind of calling back to the technicians. So, okay, great. You've had me fill out these huge work order forms and failure codes, and you made me create PM repair work orders, as I was talking about before. So now what do we do with it? There are lots of business intelligence and analytics tools on the market that will get you the graphical type reporting that you need and that leadership is looking for. So I think, depending on the folks in the audience, you may have had to pull some of those spreadsheets, kind of manipulate those things so that you're getting the KPIs and the reporting that the boss wants. Ideally, you'll find these business intelligence and analytics tools that we just set up those reports and it should run like clockwork. So to the extent that we can take that out of the hands and take that out of the responsibility of, trade supervisors, certainly, but even our coordinators and directors. I don't want to be spending time every month or quarter having to put some of this data together. And I think especially about some of the joint commission reporting, I'm sure many of you deal with, if we can make really nice looking reports out of our work order system that are sufficient for joint commission audits, that's extremely, extremely important for different facilities. And especially if you were to go to hospital leadership and show them the kind of information you had, that would be justification to invest some more in facilities if I saw how well organized things were. And again, analytics tools can do a lot for you. So I kind of mentioned this, we don't need to run those end of month reports. We can do scheduled reporting, just have an email get sent automatically whenever we want with the reports that anybody's asking for. We can embed some of this data into web pages. So, I'm sure you may have emergency room wait times and things like that, or I may want to publish things on our website about our sustainability. What are our energy costs by month, by building? All these tools allow you to embed those kinds of things into your web pages. So certainly worth looking at. A lot of tools, a lot of CMMS platforms may have an embedded tool. They may make their own report writing tool. But I'm sure many of your organizations may already have, maybe it's Power BI or Tableau. There's lots of them out there. And potentially you could just bring those to whatever vendor you have and connect it to your data. So again, I'm a big fan of this and it's something we've prioritized at TMA too. So just a quick example. The other benefit of those business intelligence tools is that we can connect multiple data sources. So I have my data from my work order system. Maybe I have data in an energy management system. But in my example here, I may have like labor and availability data from a timekeeping system or an HR system. So one thing I always bring up when I was implementing with customers is how to track their work order backlog. And a count of work orders is not sufficient. You know, if I have 100 work orders this month, I may be extremely busy or I may not be busy at all. A fire extinguisher work order takes 5 minutes, but an annual boiler might take considerably more than that. So what we really need to do is take the average time to complete each of our PM tasks, for example, and then we just multiply that against however many assets we have and we sum it up for the month. That should give me a pretty good idea of how long it's going to take for me to complete all my PM work orders in a particular month. So preventive maintenance average times, you know, the equipment manufacturers may publish some of that. I know there's organizations like RS Means might have some of that kind of data, but also your maintenance managers and your techs probably know too, of how long on average does it take you to perform this PM? And I bet they're pretty close. And this is, you know, pretty rote. We're doing the same stuff over and over again. So it doesn't deviate a lot from whatever that average is. So this is pretty reliable information. Now, what isn't reliable is how much time does the reactive work that we do. And the only way to really do this, in my opinion, is just take an average of a previous year, a previous quarter, you know, last year's August data, just average how much time you spent on that corrective maintenance. And then let's add that to our expected preventive maintenance. And I should get a nice total of, you know, whatever it is, maybe 10,000 hours of labor. And I want to go and look at my timekeeping system. I want to look at my projected labor hours, and I want to get an idea, do I have enough people to take care of this amount of work? And oftentimes that answer is no. And if that answer is no, then something's going to have to give. So we either need to go through what preventive maintenance things that we're not going to do. Maybe we have some more overtime. We have contractors come in. But at least we have the information. Now I can start making decisions on it. And this is one of the most powerful things to me to bring to facility leadership of, you know, with this amount of staff that I have, these are the things that I can do, and these are the things that I can't do. And, you know, we're either okay with that or we're not. But having that list is incredibly important. And then showing them, look, we're not going to be checking these different types of pieces of equipment. There we go. So kind of that last takeaway that we'll talk about here a little bit is, again, just kind of the point of the presentation overall is leverage technology. It can be incredibly helpful for you. So systems in CMMS, and you know, you'll probably hear of IWMS, integrated work management systems, and enterprise asset management. So there's a lot of acronyms out there. But you know, a lot of them are very expensive and can be difficult to implement. I'd like to think that we are not at TMA, but you know, it is a commitment from a facility to implement these types of systems. So really good planning needs to go in before you select a system or before you move to another system. And we'll kind of go through some of that in these future slides. So the first thing I would always recommend to customers, if you're looking at, you know, implementing a work order CMMS type system, preventive maintenance, is get clear requirements and start with the reporting. So I mentioned it in our previous takeaway about analytics and reporting. I think probably the easiest way to start identifying what you're going to need from a system is make a list of the reports you want. So start with where you want to finish. If you have done a great job implementing a system, what you're really going to have at the end of the day is the reports, accurate reports that come out that you all have established as your KPIs and that management is asking for. So if we've done everything properly, we have those reports. So let's make that list before we select a system so that we make the right decision. This other one, I've noticed kind of a trend in the industry here of it makes sense that most IT departments, most facilities would prefer to have one system to rule them all. You know, I understand that where we have a single vendor and it handles absolutely everything. You'll see these big ERP type systems. We'll have work order type things with them. What I would recommend is consider integrating instead of consolidating into a single platform. So, when I think of those really large ERP type organizations, how good could they possibly be at doing absolutely everything? If they're doing our HR, they're doing our accounting, they're doing our payroll, how good do we think their preventive maintenance system is? They probably offer one, but we start looking at that. Maybe it's not as usable. Our techs can't use it very well. But think of these different platforms that kind of specialize more so in their area of expertise and integrate that with your ERP. So, we don't necessarily need a single system that's running absolutely everything, in my opinion. A lot of times that means for clunky things where that's not really the area of expertise for that kind of system. Why not instead take a couple of systems that are really good at what they do and integrate them? So a good CMMS, a good technology partner is going to be able to integrate for you. So that would be another thing, is think of integration points, because that is the hallmark to me, especially in kind of today's age of facilities maintenance, of a good technology partner, a good system. And the next thing is perform some regular system audits and data assessments, and just look at what you have in your own system if you already have one implemented. And honestly, it's possible that your existing system serves all your needs, but it just wasn't set up properly. Maybe your folks aren't trained very well. You don't have good business processes, but there's nothing wrong with the software. And, I don't often say this to customers, but sometimes it is the truth. But not all problems are software problems. It's not always that we need to improve something with the software. And I'm certainly not saying that we don't need to make improvements at times at TMA. For sure we do, but not all problems are software problems. A lot of times we can narrow it down to some training, maybe some bad process, and we just re-implement the same system. So something to consider. Okay, so that was really what I had for you today. At this point, what I'd like to do is just turn it back over to Amy, and if anybody has any questions, be happy to answer anything that you have.
Yes, thank you very much, Joe. That's a great presentation. We do have a few questions coming in. Just a reminder, you can type in any questions you have for Joe in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Joe, can you talk a little bit about what technology you would recommend for those individuals that might be in a hybrid workforce right now, whether the facilities directors and managers are not necessarily in the buildings, or they're managing multiple buildings that they're not, in every day?
Yeah, so that would be, kind of towards at the end of the presentation, as we were talking about evaluating systems. Mobile capabilities are really, really important. And there's a couple of things to think about when you're evaluating those mobile capabilities. Is the full web, is it an application, is it an actual mobile app, or is it the full website that you can bring up on a device? So the best case scenario to me is that I could use both. So if I wanted to log into Web TMA, for example, and all I had with me was a tablet and I'm on the go, I want to be able to do that, but maybe at times I just want to use a simplified version in an app. So having both available would be good.
Perfect. We have another question here. You talked about refining the PM schedules when talking about proactive facility maintenance. How might that differ between different industries like healthcare and education?
Yeah, and that's, I try to make sure that I spoke to this during the presentation, where I think healthcare in particular, manufacturing somewhat, we have to be very, very careful about modifying our PM schedules. So to the extent that we can, we should, but in healthcare, with the intense regulatory environment that the folks on this call are in, we got to be very careful of deviating from those manufacturer recommendations. That being said, though, there are ways, and I'm not going to say I'm an expert. I'm sure there's folks on this call that are, of documenting properly your alternate equipment maintenance programs, so that if you do deviate, you have what you need to provide to Joint Commission if they were to ask.
Perfect. Joe, when you were talking about building security, obviously the facility manager in some of these larger hospitals, there is a security department. Can you talk about like working with other departments as you kind of implement some of these new technologies?
Yeah, sure. So, there's a couple of ways, and I think, some of the more common things that I've dealt with is a lot of times in higher education, but they'll have campus security and they'll have their own software for all sorts of emergency response and tracking and things like that. So, we would typically try to give them a login to TMA, but kind of to that last point of, in this new era, what we really need to do is integrate with those other systems. So what we do at TMA quite a bit is making sure that we can ingest work orders and work requests from almost any system you can imagine. So, if it's a different software that our security folks are using, that we've set up some API endpoints, things like that, where, if they click a button, we're going to get a work order and get a notification. So just making sure that you can integrate is really important.
We have a question, and do you recommend any particular key management modules or types of key modules?
Sure. Well, so this one's tough because, with the disclosure, I do work for TMA, so I'd recommend TMA's key management module, certainly. But for some of the more analog things, there's lots of, I don't know the brands of some of those key cabinets, but the electronic ones, there was one called KeyTrack that I've seen quite a bit in different facilities that might be worth looking at. And I think, again, sometimes those things, the sticker shock is pretty up there, but think of that liability of, do we really want to know who had a key, when they had it, and what it accesses? It might be worth the investment.
Perfect. Joe, do you see any kind of commonality among all your different customers with some of their top KPIs? Is there, certain
Sure.
top 3 KPIs that most facilities are looking for these days?
Yeah, sure. Some of the very basic ones I would say would be my PM task compliance. So am I hitting everything by my due date? So what I want to do is I'm always wanting to total up by month. What is the percentage of work that I'm doing by the due date? And I probably want to group that by priority and whether it's regulatory and that kind of thing. So I'm going to have KPIs that'll be a little bit different for regulatory. I want 100% on those. Maybe I'm okay with 80 on some of the other stuff. So just make sure you set up the system properly to do it. But then just open versus closed by month. So how much is flowing in and how much are we closing? So what is that delta as we go month to month? How many work orders? Is that number getting larger as we go through? Because if it is, that's a problem.
Perfect. We have a question. With healthcare, is there preloaded PMs that align with CMS?
Yeah, so we try to, at TMA anyway, and I'm sure it's true at other organizations, we try to stay away from that, a little bit of preloading PMs, and especially, again, just because of those regulatory requirements. And Joint Commission changes things occasionally, so we try to never dictate that for our customers, and I'm sure other vendors would be similar. So if there are folks on the call, one thing that I think we would be very interested in is, companies that are keeping that kind of Joint Commission requirement stuff up, if they have preloaded PMs, associated with the make model and pieces of make and model of pieces of equipment, that would be stuff we would love to provide to our customers. But it's not something that we do of right now. And I think, again, just with that regulatory environment, we just try to be very, very careful of not leading somebody down the wrong path.
Yeah, it's the regulatory environment, and then it's also just some of the changing, code of standard care these days.
Yes.
Some of those hospital rooms and patient rooms.
Yeah, absolutely.
You mentioned doing system audits and having good data structure. Can you expand on what that might look like?
Yeah, sure. So that, of course, that's a service that we provide, our consulting group does, but I think customers that are a little more mature, they are more than capable of doing it on their own. And the way that I would do that is, again, I always think of those reports and those analytics. Take your KPIs and run them, and then tell me if you're getting what you need and if you actually trust that data. And if we don't trust it, we need to start kind of digging in and seeing why. And some of the most common reasons is we've given access to people to add things in the system that shouldn't have access. So we end up with redundant values of, I have 3 ways of describing preventive maintenance. I called one PM, I called the other preventive maintenance. And we just end up with these things where now I can't report on a solid field that I know this is all my preventive maintenance work or all my regulatory work. So if you haven't set everything up and categorized things properly, those reports won't make any sense. And as soon as we start seeing the reports aren't making any sense, we need to take a deeper look.
Just a reminder, if you have any questions, put them into the chat. Doesn't look like we have any more coming in. The information's on the screen, so if you have any follow-up questions you'd like to ask, please feel free to send that into that. Joe, any final thoughts for our audience today?
Yeah, really just thank you for joining. I always love interacting with facilities folks. So thank you very much for joining. And again, like Amy said, if you guys have any questions at all, feel free to submit them. If we need to follow up later, be happy to answer anything that anybody has. Thank you guys for your time.
Perfect. Thank you again, Joe, for your time today and for this great presentation, and to TMA Systems for sponsoring this presentation. Again, you'll get an email after this event with a copy of the slides, and the archive is at healthcarefacilitiestoday.com/webcast. You'll also get a link to take your CEU assessment, and we hope to see you at a future Healthcare Facility Today event. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Stay safe.
Yep. Thanks all. Bye.